It's a group that was gathered around the school of Abraham in ancient Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia. In those times, the cradle of human civilization took place there. Human society was going through a crisis. People were living well. They were socially balanced. But then, human egoism erupted. And that meant that people started fighting, conflicts started growing, rifts between people and communities and societies. That's the symbol. That is the symbol of the Tower of Babel. That symbol of how people stopped understanding each other. So in that ancient Babylon, there was a spiritual leader. He was one of those idol worshippers. A lot of the people then were sort of idol worshippers. And he researched what was going on. What he understood was that human egoism was simply evolving. And that's why people then suddenly became unfriendly towards each other, hostile towards each other. So he called upon everyone and tried to tell people that we have to rise above that growth of the human ego, above the hatred and animosity, and try to create a positive human connection on top of that growing separation. Some people of those Babylonians followed him, some didn't. That includes King Nimrod, who was a king at that time in those areas. And so what Abraham did was he called upon the people who understood what he was saying. He told them, come along, and he gathered them. And so he taught them how to practice being connected, being together despite the growing ego. That was a condition that he articulated as love covers all crimes. What that means is that the connection needs to cover all the gaps and differences between people and to make them one. It's actually a simple formula. It's very not simple to carry out, but because we're talking about a time that is about 3,500 years ago, some people were able to do that back then. And so he put together a group, and he led that group. And so that group later called itself Israel. It's actually a combination of two words, Isra, which means directly towards the higher force of nature. They understood that force to be a force of integration and connection, unconditional connection. And so they started to direct themselves towards that force, in line with that force. Later on, there was a conflict in Babylon between that group and the rest of Babylon. And Abraham led that group towards the land of Canaan, what is today's Israel, and that group grew and grew over time. What's interesting about that group is that they used to practice that principle, that the connection between them is the main thing, is the most important thing, to be connected above all differences. And so they existed that way a few hundred years until they began to separate. They couldn't hold on to that connection, and that's because naturally human ego is developing, it's evolving from generation to generation, and people grow further apart, and they stop feeling that they're interconnected, that they're inherently connected. And so we should mention here that I'm saying people came to this group from all the different nations, from all the different cultures and nations who lived in Babylon. And therefore, they didn't have any familial connection at first. They were very diverse. They were a diverse group of people until, as long as that concept of connection held them together, they were as one people. But when the ego erupted, later, they separated and they began to be just like the rest of the nations who existed in ancient Babylon. And so, since then, that group exists, but it doesn't know its origin and why it acts the way it does. These people are actually very different from each other. In terms of race, in terms of DNA, you can find traces of a lot of different nations. They come from all the nations of the world. And so today, they exist to this day in this situation where, on the one hand, they exist to be able to serve as a model of rising above the human ego and living together in a connected fashion as a symbol for, or as a model for the rest of human society. That's also something that that scriptures explain. On the other hand, they fell from that degree of connection, of higher human connection, and they're actually separate from each other and in conflict. And what ties them together today is only the animosity from the rest of the nation